Welcome to the Exponential Australia Church Leaders Podcast.
Well, hello Exponential Australia. Again, it is so wonderful to have you with us today as we've been hearing from a wide range of leaders from all across the Australian church, but more than that, also the global church. And today we are so delighted to be joined by Keri Ladouceur, making sure that I get that one right. We'll talk about that in just a moment, who leads the Naperville physical campus as part of Community Christian Church, which is part of the family of churches that is led by Dave Ferguson, that is very intimately involved with Exponential in the US. And Keri, we are so delighted that you are joined with us, particularly as it's right in the middle of dinner time in the US. We're so glad that you're joined with us this evening.
Oh, I'm so excited to be here with you and happy to carve out the time to make it happen.
Yeah, so great. Well, part of the reason that I reached out to Keri was particularly around my recent trip to the US, being part of Exponential in Orlando, and hearing Keri speak I was just absolutely taken aback, so inspired by her leadership. And she wouldn't say this, she wouldn't lead with this, but the church that she leads is actually the largest female-led church in the United States of America, which I know is not something that you necessarily fly the flag on, but it is worth mentioning that the high quality of leader that she is and has a wide range of experiences. And I guess for those who haven't heard of you before, Keri, I wonder if you just give a bit of a sketch as to your ministry background, where have you come from, how do you spend your time, and why is multiplication so high on your agenda as a leader, and the way that you lead, in all range of ways. We'd just love to hear a bit more from you.
Yeah. Okay, I'll go back far, but I'll go fast here. Ministry was never on my radar early on. I actually was in the marketplace, so like helping scale businesses and even doing some kind of marketplace consulting there, and found my way back to God in my early 20s. Like I darkened the doors of a church on an Easter Sunday. So 17 years ago, we're about to have Easter here. And at that point in my life, like I had tried everything the world had to offer that was going to make me feel whole or fulfilled, and turned up empty. And I was like, I think people go to church on Easter. I think I'm going to try that. Like I made money and partied and had access to all the things. And I experienced the Holy Spirit on that Sunday and left thinking like, okay, if this is real, like if Jesus is real and resurrection life is available to me, this probably changes like everything in my life. And so I left there. I put this passage from Mark 8:35 on my bathroom mirror. And it's like, if you want to find your life, you have to be willing to lose it and take mine. And if you're willing to lose your life, you're going to find life in me. And so I just every day would look at that and like really dove into the Word of God. I started leading a small group a couple weeks later. I don't know who on the earth thought that was a good idea at that church to like tap me on the shoulder and let me have people in my home and try to teach them something of meaning about the Bible. But and not long after that, I started serving in student ministry. It really changed the way I ran my business. It changed my relational patterns and habits and how I spent my time and my money. And one day the executive pastor of the church called and said, "Hey, I know you've been building restaurants, and I wonder if you've ever thought about building ministries." And I was like, no, I have never thought about doing that. But he was trying to hire a middle school pastor actually. And so I spent some time like dreaming and praying and kind of seeking God on it, and came back from that time really full of vision for what the ministry was supposed to be, who I would recruit to be a part of it, how we would train them. Like I had all these ideas. I remember telling my dad, I think I can do this for like 2 years on the salary before I'll be out of money, like with my savings. And, it's this huge pay cut. And it was just the greatest time of my life, getting to step into like this opportunity to be used by God. I brought some of the ministry planning tools and resources from the marketplace into the church world. I found myself kind of disillusioned with what leadership looked like in the church and felt like we should be more intentional about the bottom line in the church. And then not long after that, I moved to the Chicagoland area to Willow Creek Community Church. And I did high school ministry there and adult ministry there. I was there for about 10 years. During that time, I got to do quite a bit of consulting and coaching with other churches and some denominations, and just helping church leaders get clear on their mission and kind of their articulation of the mission of the church, their vision, their strategy. How do you align staff and resources and people around kind of where we're headed and what direction we're all rowing in, and staff engagement and staff health and that kind of stuff. And then I left Willow about 6 years ago, and did, my husband and I did revitalization work at a church. So a kind of a dying church. The founding pastor had retired. We stepped in there to do church turnaround work. I started an organization called New Ground Network, where I do that kind of coaching and consulting work still. And then about 2 years ago, in the middle of a pandemic, actually 2 weeks before the pandemic, Dave Ferguson was like, "Oh, you should come lead community." Like, started having these conversations. A buddy of ours who led worship at Exponential started it. And then as the pandemic started, we just really casually started engaging in conversations, and it just became really clear that God was inviting us to move to Chicago again.
Wow.
And so I have been here for about 2 years. Yeah. It was a lot.
Absolutely.
That's my history.
Keri. And there's so many different experiences that you kind of just casually mention. Of course, we could dive deeply into any one of those.
Sure.
I guess as you've kind of would have gone through some hard times, I can imagine in some of your season at Willow Creek, retrospectively, starting a business and some of your corporate, nous by way of being able to help the church actually bring some strategy to what they're doing.
Sure.
I know this is a very generic question, but would there be, any kind of like themes that you would pick from that, and what the Lord has kind of been able to bring to your attention, particularly as you step into this new post-pandemic season in leading in God's church?
Oh, yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of hard fought insights from that last season, and I could give you kind of the practical ministry side, and I could give you the really personal spiritual side on that. You had also asked kind of how I got into this multiplication way of thinking about church. And when I left Willow, I mean, it was one of the most invigorating, intensive, stretching. It was an awesome time to be there. I was shaped in some really tremendous ways, but there was also a lot of harm there. And so when I left, it was under some pretty difficult circumstances, kind of related to the lead pastor and power abuse, and trying to tell the truth about that there. I left pretty disillusioned just with what my experience was in the church. I was really betrayed in that process by church leaders, and in a lot of ways kind of went through this maybe deconstruction of like, okay, this faith tradition that I'm coming out of, I experienced a lot of betrayal in it. And so it caused me to just get really curious about like what my definitions for leadership were in the church, or what kind of my definition for success of what even is the church and what is the role of a pastor. And, I just kind of had to take all of those things apart and really explore them and interrogate some of my own assumptions and the ways that I saw the world or what ministry was. And there was a season there I thought I didn't want to have anything to do with the church. Yeah. And I think that just met me in what I would call a real wilderness season. And I had no place for a theology of suffering, or for, I kind of had a prosperity gospel, if I'm honest with you, before that. And so I think the faith that I walked through the wilderness with, I came out of the other side with a much more durable faith and a much more real sense of the presence of Jesus with me. And hopefully, I don't know, this is true, but hopefully more of God's heart for what the church is supposed to be. Yeah. I went to seminary during that time too, and just really started unpacking like, oh wait, the church doesn't have a mission. God's mission is to redeem and restore the world, and the church is God's strategy to do that. Like it really reoriented some things for me. And so I hope all that gets to shape my coaching and consulting work. And I love getting to go in and ask hard questions and challenge status quo. And sometimes it's like organizational counselor, and sometimes I'm saying the thing that everybody's thinking that nobody will say. It's a little bit of instigating in some of that work. But I think the multiplication part really came in of like, there were ways that I had taken on maybe the world's ideals of success or leadership or up and to the right. And so God used this kind of multiplication orientation in the church to help reframe for me, what is it we're actually trying to do here? And what's the best way to live into that? And I think that's really generative, right? Like, how do we raise up and unleash people, not kind of gather and consume And there's a lot I could repent of from what I learned in a previous era to now how I hope I approach church. And I think about that a lot.
Yeah, that's amazing, Keri. And I think this has definitely been something I've been talking about with a number of other leaders. Like, this feels like a season where God has been refining his church, refining his leaders, and therefore recognizing again that strong commitment to be a part of kind of taking the church forward, reimagining what the future could look like with healthy leadership, learning from the past, taking the best of what has been before us and actually taking it forward in fresh, new and exciting ways. Mm-hmm. And so, the pandemic, I think, has brought that about for a lot of people, personal circumstance as part of your journey, but definitely in the last number of years.
And it's expedited it, right? The pandemic, all of these patterns and trends that many of us sensed before the pandemic, or even places that there was some dissatisfaction or discouragement or disillusionment, the pandemic held up this mirror to us to see more clearly. And I think it expedited a lot of those patterns and trends. We're seeing that at least here in the West, just when it comes to engagement and re-engagement with the church. There's a lot of opportunity to reimagine.
Absolutely. Yeah, here in Australia, we talk often about the fact that, 1 out of every 3 people are open to have a spiritual conversation because of the pandemic. Like, the numbers that may have been discouraging historically are actually quite exciting at the moment for the Australian church. And so I definitely agree with what you're saying. Yeah. The next question I want to ask is particularly relating to, again, when we met in Orlando, a colleague of mine and we came along to the Women in Ministry elective at the pre-conference session. And I must admit, when we came along, we kind of thought it would be this diverse male and female opportunity to kind of ask questions about how do we give more opportunity to women in leadership. Yeah. And we found out that we were the only 2 males in the room at that time, which was kind of a funny experience. But I love the way that you were kind of describing what exponential is before we hit record. It's this big tent where people can come and be part of a network, irrespective of theological distinctives and all range of things like that. But I wanted to ask particularly about your journey as an incredible woman in leadership, who, again, we've just met over the last couple of weeks, but I was really inspired by some of the things that you had to share in that pre-conference session. And just particularly about how you've gone about navigating your journey of being a strong female leader, of being one that is taking the church forward, that's being entrepreneurial, bringing her gifts and abilities to the church. Like, what has been some of that journey for you as you have wrestled that through and kind of continue to lead in God's church?
Yeah. I will say it's been a journey that has evolved, because the church I referenced earlier that I found my way back to God at was certainly empowering of my gifts, but there was a lid. There were limits to the extent that I could use those. And even early on in my journey there, they hired somebody on in kind of a leadership role, and they changed my title from like a youth pastor to like a youth director or something. And that was the first time for me. I was like, wait, what? Like, I didn't even know that this was a topic. I was so new to kind of the church culture world. But that also started me on a journey of then, so what do I believe about this? And at Willow, I saw lots of empowered women teaching. They had women elders from the beginning. And I got to just try on a lot of different gifts. I think I discovered so much about even who I was at that time. Once I started having opportunities to do stuff with other churches or other denominations, I did some coaching cohorts with pastors during that time, and many of them led complementarian churches. And so it was just interesting to watch some of them be super open to my leadership and my coaching and my mentorship. And for several of them, I got to even go be the first woman to teach in their context. And I don't think that they're going to hire a woman teaching pastor. They might have said I shared instead of taught or preached, because that's some of the ways that we kind of get around that with language. But I think my own journey has just been truly trying to embrace my gifts and be attentive to the doors that the Lord has opened. I never wanted to be a teacher or write a book or build a platform. And as people in my life have affirmed gifts, I have felt like, okay, this is a stewardship thing for me. I went to seminary because I wanted to steward those opportunities responsibly. And in seminary, we've done a lot of work on this. So I feel like my own journey is now that I have grown and learned and evolved some, and maybe have more clarity about where I fall. There's also something really important to me about then how do I hold that in a way that can honor and respect and actually embody the mutuality I think that we're supposed to embody, even with people who don't believe the same way. And that's really tricky. And there are times, just candidly, that's really painful. But when I'm truly able to hold my calling as like, I have nothing to earn, I have nothing to prove, I have nothing to gain, I have nothing to lose, then I don't need the validation or affirmation of the person in front of me. And one of the most kind of beautiful byproducts of that is I'll never forget teaching at a buddy's church out in San Francisco. And afterwards, I had a woman come up to me and she was like, I do not understand. How do you do what you do? Like, how do you justify what you do? And I'll just never forget in that moment, I had this decision of like, okay, I could be really triggered and offended because that's kind of an offensive thing to say to somebody, or I can set all of the personal parts of that aside and enter into this opportunity to pastor this woman because God's doing something in her. And it ended up being this really beautiful and rich conversation because I'm like, I don't need to change her mind. I don't need her endorsement on what I do. I just want to pastor her well. And maybe that in and of itself will speak more loudly than any kind of answer or apologetic I can give her. So, I mean, it's been tricky and there's challenges and there's painful times, but I think it's just been saying, okay, I just want to be faithful at the end to have stewarded well what God put in me. And if that disrupts the status quo or challenges people or whatever, then I also want to really model a gracious, humble approach to engage in that conversation and be loving, even if somebody doesn't agree with how I see those texts. Is that what you're asking?
Absolutely,
is that
it is.
okay?
Yeah. And I guess the kind of follow up to that question, Keri, would be like, particularly, and again, recognizing there's differences in God's church, there's beauty and the diversity of God's church. But for churches that do want to begin to empower women more in ministry leadership, for instance, for me as a male, and I have a wonderful wife who leads very passionately alongside me. But how can I be looking to empower women more, like particularly again based upon their gifting and their merit? Like how can we potentially address some of the systemic disadvantages that women may have when it comes to leading in God's church?
Yes. So I had a conversation about this with some buddies who are all pastors on a podcast recently. And I jokingly answered that question with like, well, you could go home and do the dishes. because what that gets at is beyond just a theological kind of frame for this conversation, which I am delighted to work with men that share the same theological frame that I have on this, because it changes the starting point, right? But beyond that, there are all sorts of tradition. There are ways that we're cultured and socialized according to tradition. So there's like the theological layer. Do you agree or do you believe that, women in leadership, that's one part of it, but our tradition has been predominantly male-led. The ways that we culture and socialize men and women are so different from such a young age. And so if we actually want to be advocates for raising up and unleashing more women in leadership, we have to grow in our awareness of those things. And we have to grow in our awareness of the biases that those things create, even within us. So there's a book called Brave Women that Ellen Duffield wrote, and she's like a researcher, and she learned that a woman's self-confidence peaks at 9 years old. It's the highest it will ever be at 9 years old, because there's something about that concrete and abstract thinking at that age. That's the age a woman realizes she's never going to live up to all the expectations that they have of her, that the world has of her. And when you think about the confusing messages of like, be a mom, don't be a mom, work outside of the home, stay home, have a voice, but play small, be submissive, don't take up too much space, accommodate. Women are taught to acquiesce. Women are taught to kind of manage the domestic details and care for the emotional needs. And these are really subtle things. But what that happens then in the boardroom when you're trying to solve a problem or cast vision or talk about the way of the future, and women are supposed to like accommodate and care, one, they're not even going to speak up unless they're asked. And so she just talks about these really tangible things. Like if you want the opinion of women, one, you have to have them in the room. You can watch kind of in middle school when a teacher asks a question, all the girls raise their hand and all the boys just speak the answer out.
Yeah.
And so you just think, and that's because of, I mean, it's not malicious. Like I'm not beating men up. It's just, there are dynamics like how we project women in movies and commercials and how we saw our parents, and all those things then factor into how we see women and men. I think we do women and men a real disservice by separating genders for development. Like I think when I have done coaching cohorts, when there are men and women, I always watch the women fumble to find their voice in that space. But it's easier to find your voice in that space than in a circle of men who are probably in a position of authority over you. And I always watch the men every time go home with like a new imagination for the women in their context, because they're like, these women had such brilliant things to say, and it, you know, really challenged them or encouraged them or inspired them. And so there are some real practical things like that, like being aware of, you have to ask women for their opinion. They're not just going to voice it most of the time. Yeah, being aware of just the male female dynamics, knowing how to look for and steward those gifts in women. So that's another real challenge. If you have a woman with a teaching gift, if there are not other women teachers to point her towards, what men are going to step in and then help develop those gifts in her, right? Like, and then that means we have to ask questions about relationships with men and women. And do we have boundaries that stand in the way of true collegial brother and sister kind of development and engagement? And I've given you a couple of things there. Which direction?
That's phenomenal, Keri, and heaps of food for thought. I guess my final question for us today, and our great hope and prayer at Exponential and for the Australian Church, is to see all range of people, obviously men and women, raised and released into ministries that advance the kingdom, that multiply God's church. But particularly today, talking about, female church planters, talking about younger leaders who may kind of just be sitting in that birthing of what the Lord might be doing in them at this time. What is some wisdom that you would want to offer, particularly as they may be early on in that journey, or sensing that call, or wondering where to start in the Lord's call upon their life towards church planting, leadership? What would be some of your wisdom after that, the incredible experiences that you've had to people who might be sitting in that boat?
I would say to the men that are trying to kind of unlock that or figure out the code to that, I would say be the most permission giving, encouraging leader that you can be. When you see gifts in women, when you see somebody who could facilitate a conversation or an alpha group or a small group, will have them host on a weekend. When you see somebody that can communicate well, give them an opportunity to teach, challenge, invest in them, because that's part of then what becomes constraining for women is just the imagination they can have because of what they have or haven't seen modeled. And so when you're a brother, when you're a leader, when you're a mentor to women, to be able to call them forward and be permission giving and maybe dream or have imagination for how those gifts could be used in the kingdom beyond what they could even imagine today, I think that would be a real tremendous gift. And I think to the women to say yes, like there's real constraints on like when there's a job opportunity, a man will apply if he has like 50 or 60% of the criteria. A woman will only apply if she has like 100% of the criteria on there. So for a woman to feel like, I don't know if I'm totally prepared for that, but if you're going to help me, I'm going to say yes. Right. So to say yes to those opportunities, if somebody sees something in you, to not discredit it or discount it, but to say yes to how God's stirring through, brothers and sisters, I think is really important.
Wow, Keri, we have so appreciated your voice today. Like, thank you so much for your insights and for your wisdom. And yeah, my hope and prayer from today is that this would definitely encourage some more conversations within God's church. And as I said before, as we long to see the Australian church move towards multiplication and doing whatever it takes to see that happen. And my personal conviction is that will happen through the empowering of women in ministry. And so just want to thank you again for your time today, Keri.
Yeah, thank you so much for what you're doing there, Charlie, in Australia. Thanks for letting me join you for this. And I'm really excited for what's ahead for Exponential Australia.
Awesome.
Thanks for listening. For more great resources, please head to our website at exponential.org.au.